Thank you for the introduction and thank you for this opportunity to present my work today. I would like to present the research conducted during my second year master's internship. The aim of this study is to assess the impact of an epidemic-driven demographic crisis on the living conditions of populations in its immediate aftermath. Why did I do that? I did because epidemics cannot be understood as purely sanitary events. They represent major environmental constraints that profoundly affect social structures and economic systems and ways of life. And as can be observed today, infectious disease transmissions are closely linked to societal organization, and the consequences extend well beyond the domain of health alone. And the Black Death struck here between 1348 and 1352 and caused the death of tens of millions of individuals. So it provides a relevant case study for that. The demographic shock it generated reshaped social and economic balances. It raises important questions about the biological and behavioral responses of populations confronted with this new constraint. But it was within an already unfavorable environmental context that the Black Death emerged, because here, from the early 14th century onward, Europe experienced climatic deterioration associated with the Little Ice Age. And these conditions, of course, affected agricultural productivity and contributed to food insecurity, rising prices, and recurrent famines. And in this unfavorable context, the Black Death emerged. From the resulting demographic shock led to socioeconomic transformations linked to labor shortages, including rising wages, declining rents, changes in access to land, and also an expansion of pastoral. And this shift likely influenced living conditions through access to resources, housing, diet, and care, and all that. So in this context, in this situation, bioarchaeology provides a valuable framework for exploring biological and functional responses to this crisis. This study, therefore, tries to assess whether the demographic crisis associated with the Black Death resulted in measurable changes in living conditions in the south of France. So this study is based on human remains from two archaeological sites in Toulouse, the two blue stars here, the site here, 16 Rue des 36 Ponts, and the Saint-Michel cemetery here. And the close spatial proximity within the medieval Saint-Michel suburb, located in green on the map here, south of the city, allows for direct comparisons between populations exposed to distinct chronological context while controlling for the local urban environment. First, the site at 16 Rue des 36 Ponts is associated with the Black Death epidemic between 1348 and 1352. And then the Saint-Michel cemetery document the post-epidemic period through phases 4A and 4B, which include burials dating from the mid-14th to the mid-16th century. In this study, the analysis focuses on the craniofacial block, mandible, and teeth of 133 individuals from the Rue des 36 Ponts and 58 individuals from the Saint-Michel cemetery. And these observations are then complemented by infracranial skeletal matrix data, here comprising 187 individuals from La Rue des 36 Ponts and 156 individuals from the Saint-Michel cemetery. A multi-proxy approach was implemented to assess the living conditions of the studied populations through a range of different biological markers, biological indicators. Here, first fluctuating asymmetry was analyzed as a marker of developmental stress using cranial, mandibular, dental, and infracranial measurements. And then linear enamel hypoplasia was used to identify episodes of stress experienced during childhood. Then dentacry were used to investigate dietary practices. And finally, osteometric measurements of the infracranial skeleton were used as indicators of growth patterns. Comparisons were conducted both between sites and within each site, each time according to sex and age at death. Results reveal contrasting patterns depending on indicators considered. Here, for example, unfortunately, with regard to fluctuating asymmetry, no significant differences are observed in intersite comparisons. But luckily, hypoplasia shows differences between sites, so between periods. Here, the number of hypoplasia per tooth is significantly lower in the Saint-Michel cemetery in the post-epidemic period. And it is the case both among adults and immature individuals. And also, a decrease in hypoplasia frequency is observed among female individuals at the Saint-Michel cemetery. Osteometric measurements here indicate a significant increase in stature following the epidemic, so at the Saint-Michel cemetery, particularly among male individuals in blue. And this increase is accompanied by more pronounced sexual dimorphism in the post-epidemic period. And finally, dental indicators here indicate a significant increase in caries at the Saint-Michel cemetery. It means that carious individual, carious teeth, but also antemortem tooth loss are more frequent, and lesions are generally more advanced at the Saint-Michel cemetery in gray here than in the Rue des 30 Points in black. And this pattern is observed among adults, but also among young adults and immature individuals, indicating that it is not solely age-related. The increase in caries frequency is particularly marked among female individuals. So the results highlight here diachronic changes in the study area that are consistent with the modification of living conditions following the epidemic. Here, the higher frequency of caries at the Saint-Michel cemetery, particularly among female, may reflect a more diversified diet with increased consumption of refined sugar or more frequent food intake. And this interpretation is consistent with the available isotopic data for the two sites here, which show higher delta 15 N values among female, the red dot, after the epidemic, following the epidemic, suggesting an increased access to animal-based resources. And the decrease in hypoplasia frequency among females also point toward a reduction in childhood stress during childhood. And among males, a relative improvement in living conditions is suggested here by the decrease of the number of hypoplasia per tooth, but also the increase in male stature following the epidemic. But this study nevertheless has several limitations, as any other studies. Even if the plague leaves no trace on the bones and isn't selective, the nature of epidemic context inevitably influences the composition of the studied populations. It's totally different from a parish cemetery. And in addition, the interpretation of biological markers remain constrained here by the complexity of their etiologies. But this study nevertheless evaluated the effect of the Black Death on the living conditions in Toulouse. And the result we have here indicate changes consistent with the relative post-epidemic improvements, including dietary diversification, increased male stature, and also a reduced frequency of stress exposure during childhood. However, these changes here, these improvements remain partial and uneven. Female stature remains stable, hypoplasia is still frequent among males, and no substantial change is observed in fluctuating asymmetry. And the moderate magnitude of these changes can be partly explained by the specific suburban context of Toulouse. This context is characterized by, during the 14th century, by a strong urban dynamics and processes of social and biological recomposition due to the urbanization of the suburb. And these factors complicate, obviously, the distinction between epidemic-related effects and those linked to population mobility or group renewal due to the urbanization. Moreover, rapid urbanization in a suburb and a poor suburb may have limited the extent of health improvements. So this case study highlights that biological responses to major environmental constraints, such as an epidemic, are not uniform, but embedded within complex social and ecological trajectories. It also underscores the value of a multi-policy approach to refine understanding of biological and behavioral responses of populations to a crisis in medieval societies, in medieval urban societies here. And moreover, it appears here that improvements in living conditions are reflected differently in the skeleton according to sex, through distinct and differentiated biological responses. So the integration of genetic data, complementary isotopic evidence, or paleopathological data will make it possible to better distinguish the effect of the living conditions from those related to population composition. And since we are in a poor suburb here, it will be interesting to examine whether similar trends, similar tendencies are observed at other sites in Toulouse with more socioeconomically advantaged population, such as Saint-Cernin Cemetery or Saint-Étienne Cemetery. Thank you for your attention.